Recall his notion of happiness as moderation targets this concept called sophrosyne, which focuses upon this idea of having not too much of a particular characteristic or not enough of a particular character trait. What we're supposed to seek, according to him, is seek the virtue. The virtue is best thought of as the mean between the two extremes of, and remember, these are both called vices, the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. I talked about his discussion of courage as a virtue. Were there any of the other ones on that list that you wanted to discuss? Remember, the person with too much courage would be described as foolhardy, and the person with too little exhibits what we call cowardice. And most of you got this right on the homework question. How does one become virtuous? Yeah, I'll write down. How does one become virtuous? Recall that Aristotle says that few people are quote-unquote virtuous by nature. If you do happen to be virtuous by nature, that would be an example of what Aristotle might call moral luck. In other words, if you just happen to be pretty well equipped from the get-go with many of these virtues, it means you got lucky. Probably due to a combination of what we would today call genetics and good nurture. Most people have to do what? Most people have to work at it. In other words, very few people are at the mean. You're either somewhere in the area of deficiency or somewhere along the area of excess. Now the idea is, if you want to find out what the virtue is, what you're best off doing is doing what a naturalist would do. You ought to become a keen observer of people. See which people seem to have virtue, see which people don't seem to have it. Which kind of people do you want to glom onto? Yeah, the people who have virtue. And I'm going to use a word that is not in your textbook. A person who is virtuous is a person that you should take as what we call an exemplar. An exemplar, and what word does it sound a little like?
Example.
Thank you. Yeah, an example. You find this exemplar and you try to mimic what that person does. By doing things that virtuous people do, the idea is if you can make them your habit, eventually they will become part of your, what we call your character. If we say that a person acts out of character, what we're saying is the person does not do something that is normally characteristic of them. Suppose that someone is habitually punctual, turns in all her homeworks on time, and then all of a sudden, she starts not turning her homework in on time. I would say that she had acted out of character. And I would start to probably what? Yeah, I might start to wonder why. What has happened? Because people normally do what? That's why we call it their character. People act in accordance with their character. The idea is to make the virtues normal for you, part of your character. Who will be better off if you become virtuous? It's a multiple. Yeah, you will and everybody else. All the people who come into contact with you. To become virtuous for Aristotle was basically a prerequisite for being what? The virtuous person is a happy person. This is because give me 30 seconds. This is because the virtuous person has the experience and the character traits to help her to handle life well. Now, this does not mean that everything will always go perfectly. But what it does mean is that the person who possesses the virtues will be better equipped to deal with life on life's terms than the person who lacks the virtues. Mr. Peters.
Not to move forward on us too much, but Stoicism praises kind of like detachment, like almost consistent emotions. And then Aristotle praises habit, which is the contiguous use of something. So are those two concepts kind of integrated to some extent, like just consistency in general?
I would say that there are similarities between the two. As a matter of fact, most of the things that Aristotle would call good character traits, most traditions that emphasize virtues would call them that too. Now, there will be some definite differences. And to mention what Mr. Peters said, to push us forward a little bit, one of the Stoic virtues is the idea that we ought to be dispassionate. We ought to become emotionally detached from things. Not only because too many emotional detachments makes us weaker and less equipped to deal with things, but in a way, our emotional attachments have the power to weaken and make us unhappy. As the Stoics would put it, if you're not attached to things, what would be able to hurt you? Nothing. If you are emotionally detached from everything, nothing will hurt you. And to sound like Socrates, even death ultimately won't bother you. Now keep in mind, Aristotle certainly would not take it that far, because for Aristotle, and this is not quite his phrase, but it's something I'm sure he wouldn't mind. Aristotle was a man who thought that we ought to actually be immersed in the world. And this was a difference between him and Plato, just to reiterate that. Plato is sometimes described as an otherworldly thinker, while Aristotle is a thoroughly this-worldly figure. He believed that we should be passionate about our lives, and that we, for our own good, ought to become virtuous. Now, in part, it's because we will be happier people that way. But this is a side note that the author does not really emphasize very much. Aristotle was one of the philosophers who defined human beings as we are not just rational animals, but we are inherently political animals. Now keep in mind, when he called us political animals, he wasn't talking about, bickering about liberals and conservatives and things of this nature. Politics refers to the science of the polity. The polis was their city-state. What he believed is that human beings, fully developed human beings, were parts of communities. And as parts of communities, we help to build good communities. And on top of that, good communities tend to do what for us? Enable us to have decent lives too. So if you actually become a virtuous person, you'll be doing good by yourself, but you will also be a better participant in your society. In other words, your happiness is not just about you. It's connected to other people's happiness too. It's connected to good societies. And by the way, this is something that Plato and Aristotle shared a belief about, even though all of the specifics differ. But both of them believed that individuals were not just individuals. We are also members of communities. And as a result, our happiness is tied up with the kind of society that we live in and vice versa. Now, any other questions about any of those other virtues on the list? If not, I'm going to dump one on you. How many of you saw that pride was listed as a virtue? Now you'll notice that pride is sometimes referred to as among those cardinal or deadly sins in the Roman Catholic tradition. Now keep in mind, when Aristotle is talking about pride, he is not talking about what Catholics are referred to as pride. What they were referring to as pride is this: vanity, aka an excessive pride. If you properly understand pride, pride isn't a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. To be proud doesn't mean to be boastful or arrogant. To be proud means something like knowing who you are, what you're capable of, but also what you're not capable of, and being confident about yourself. Pride is not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, a well-formed, virtuous person exhibits pride, but she does not exhibit too much pride. Now, the author of the text version of this called an absence of pride shyness, for lack of a better word. The reason why I don't entirely like this is because I think that there's plenty of people who appear to be shy, which doesn't mean they don't have pride. Just means they might not like to talk very much. But yeah, and this is why I think our common English word shyness doesn't quite cover it. But it's nonetheless the word that you see there. Pride in itself is a good thing. So whenever we challenge people as, pride being a vice, what we mean is an excess of pride. Just to give you a couple more. And I'll get personal for a minute. How many of you notice generosity is a virtue? And there's a good reason why generosity is a virtue. Generous people are more likely to play nicely with people in the sandbox. Generous people are likely not to be so stuck on themselves that they're no good to themselves or anyone else. Now, of course, someone who is too generous is a problem.
They don't pay for a membership to the sandbox?
Yeah, well, I was going to say the person with too much generosity is likely to give and give and give until they, the cliche, has nothing left to give. A person who is too generous might not have enough self-worth. A person who is too generous is likely to get brutally stepped on, etc., etc. And by the way, the worst kind of people recognize people who are too generous, and they what?
Manipulate?
Yeah, they manipulate, they exploit, they use it to their advantage. It doesn't behoove you to be overly generous. Now, the person who is not very generous, we typically call stingy. Now, you'll notice, and this was a question some of you may have discussed, Aristotle believes that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, having an excess of a particular trait is typically better than having a deficiency. Here's the rough reason why. If you have too much of something, it's more like training yourself to scale it back. Because it's more difficult to cultivate a trait that you have very little of. When it comes to this, I would put myself in the more stingy category. I'm neither proud of it nor particularly ashamed of it. It might be just the way I am from my inner nature that I did not choose, and also in part because of my nurture. Environments play a big role in the failure to develop particular virtues. And I don't mind going on record saying this. I grew up having what some people call a Depression-era mentality. Ever hear that phrase before? In other words, I tend to fear economic failure and the fact that, if I give away a little bit of money, I may what? I might turn around and need that. And part of it came from growing up what? Why would you say? I was never truly poor by American standards. But compared to my friends' families, we were, not well off at all. Hand-me-down clothes from other families, things of that nature. Not even from my own family, from other families. We did not grow up wealthy, and so forth. So I started to feel like there was something wrong with me. I was somehow the failure. And then I got hung up with money. In other words, I made money an end in itself. And it had nothing to do with what money could do for me. It was because I thought that people with money earned what? Yeah, and that they were the ones who deserved respect. And that because I wasn't rich, there must be something inferior about me. American society kind of trains people to think that way. Even though on some level we all know what? We all know it's bullcrap on some level. But whenever you're given this other message, it's kind of difficult to appreciate that other level. But yeah, I know that I'm kind of stingy. So I had to do what? I had to work on it. And that means to do uncomfortable things. If you're a person who perpetually keeps your wallet closed, how do you unstinge? That is a technical term. What's the only way to unstingy yourself, according to Aristotle? Start acting like a generous person, even though it's going to hurt. Because eventually, if you practice the virtues enough, you might not ever become virtuous, but you'll probably what?
Acquire more virtuous traits?
Yeah, you'll probably get closer. And sort of to wrap this stuff up, you might remember that Aristotle suggests that virtue is kind of like horseshoes and hand grenades, to use that cliche. Remember, he used the metaphor of a what? He used the metaphor of the bullseye on an archery target for talking about this. He says very few people will be able to perpetually hit the bullseye on the target. But for most of our purposes, guess what's good enough? If you can get fairly close to virtue, because remember, complete virtue is sort of an ideal. Nobody will ever fully actualize the ideal. However, you will be better off if you get close. And it might take a long time. As a matter of fact, it might take your entire life to get better at it. But you will have lived better for it. Becoming a virtuous person really is this, folks. Think of it as a process. And of course, the process is more arduous for some people than for other people. And that's just a matter of luck in some cases. That's just a matter of luck. But no matter for that, because Aristotle believed in this, he believed that we were rational beings and we could still be held what? Even though it wasn't 100% our fault. Yeah, we should still be held accountable even if it is not 100% our fault. Because as rational beings, we have the ability to reflect on our own virtues or lack thereof, and thus the ability to try to change ourselves. Now, before I totally leave this behind for Stoicism, Aristotle's ideas certainly sowed a lot of other seeds. This notion of virtue ethics will end up greatly influencing the Roman Catholic tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's one example of his massive influence. Now, how many of you, when you were reading about this sort of process of improving yourself and becoming virtuous, how many of you were perhaps reminded of Maslow? Psych 101. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, you'll notice that fairly few people, according to him, fully do this. Very few people fully self-actualize. And typically it's not 100% your fault. And this is because if you don't have certain necessary needs met first, it is difficult to fully develop as an individual. For example, if you don't have 3 squares a day and a cot, and you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, that's not to say that you will not be a decent person and so forth, but it will be a lot more challenging to fully develop as a human being. If you don't have your basic psychological needs met, and by the way, we all need them in different amounts in accordance with our own individual natures. Some people need a lot more love than some other people do. Some of us who are a little more aloof, who need a little more alone time than most people, I'll admit I'm one of those people, probably need a little bit of less of that, that kind of filial love than some people do. But we all need some degree of it. Essential to our psychological well-being. Now, it's difficult to fully develop into a self worth calling a self if you don't have these needs met. And this is consistent with Aristotelian thinking too. Because remember, it's all a process, and if certain things do not fall into place, one would be surprised if one ended up becoming virtuous. Now, this isn't to say that people who have it all handed to them will become virtuous, because why? Having everything handed to you sometimes doesn't enable you to
consider these things.
Yeah, and yet to consider these things or also give you the sort of steps towards development. As a matter of fact, someone who's had it all handed to them might actually be towards this level right here. And they may actually lack virtue for having it all. And you probably know people like this, or have heard of such people. But anyway, last questions about Aristotle. We will break to chapter 7.